So I'm going to speak about a topic that I'm studying with a team at a research grant, which is dedicated to mysticism and heresy in 13th, 14th century Italy. But the topic is much broader, and I want to begin with the distinction between monistic and theistic mysticism made by Robert Charles Taylor, an Oxford scholar of Zoroastrianism primarily, but he also wrote a book, Mysticism, Sacred and Profane, which was influential, among other things, in Platonian studies, because John Rist used that in his 1967 book about Plotinus, The Road to Reality. And it's often criticized, for instance, by John Kusanich, a Platonian scholar. So it's still alive, whatever people think about this distinction. And he divided mysticism into four types, but I'm not going to mention the other two, just the monistic and the theistic. And this is a very, I would say, also practical topic for spiritual life. A long time ago, when I began my spiritual path, I met a lot of people interested in Eastern religions, Eastern mysticism, people belonging to what I think we could call New Age, broadly conceived. And one thing that I was struck by was the insistence that we are God. Everything is one. Everything that exists is God. So we are God. And the point of spiritual life is to realize that we are God. And at the same time, well, some of these people, at least, were Christians. So there was an inevitable tension between that claim and the traditional Christian mysticism. Although many people would say that, well, this is the secret hidden core of Christian mysticism. And there is even a book by Rudolf Otto, the great German scholar, in which he compares Shankara and Meister Eckhart. I think advancing a hypothesis that basically there is little difference between these two medieval thinkers of the West and the East. So Taylor thinks that monistic and theistic mysticism is a key distinction between Abrahamic religions on the one hand, theistic mysticism, and at least some forms of Asian mysticism, which would be monistic. I think, well, I as you can see in the handout, I sort of explain the monistic mysticism as being God and theistic as becoming God. Two things that I should probably briefly define is monistic, theistic, and God, these three concepts. I will start with God. So, pardon me for this crude attempt to define God, but I think when we look at the tradition, the Platonic Western metaphysical tradition, God is the creator. That means the source or the first cause of all reality, and it means that God has to contain in him all the things that are created, because it's impossible, according to thinkers like Plotinus or Augustine or Gregory of Nyssa and others, it's impossible for anything to produce something greater, ontologically richer than itself. So if God is the first cause, it means that things that are created have to exist in God, but in some other manner. Plotinus says they exist as me diaque crimena. They are not differentiated because God is one. But that leads to a conclusion that, for instance, we cannot say that God is impersonal, because if God created personal beings like gods or angels in Christian tradition and us, it means that he has to be more than that. So he has to contain what we refer to as personality in some infinitely greater manner. And we cannot exactly understand how this works, but from this perspective, it's impossible that an impersonal principle could produce personal, because the personal, metaphysically speaking, is one of the, if not the richest aspect of reality. So what's the difference between monism and theism? By theism, I mean what Brian Davis, American Thomist, refers to as classical theism, as opposed to theistic personalism, which is widespread in modern theology, especially Protestant theology. So classical theism is just that I mentioned. So God is everything that exists, and he creates reality, which doesn't add being or reality, because God is infinite reality, so you cannot really add anything to infinity. and the world, creation, is a revelation of God, an image of God, manifestation of God, theophany. But it's not simply identical to God. So this is classical theism, while theistic personalism, according to Davies, is a belief that God is just supermind, a personal mind that is like us, just infinitely more powerful. The problem with that is that then God has some limits, because to be a person or to be a mind is to be limited, while God, or Aquinas or Plotinus or Nicholas of Cusa, cannot be limited by anything. So as Martin Buber said, God is also a person. And Buber believed that was Spinoza's mistake. Spinoza had a problem with seeing that, well, Spinoza denied that God is a person because he didn't want a limited God, but Buber said, well, Spinoza couldn't understand that God is also a person, which is, of course, crucial for the Jewish or Christian or Muslim tradition. So this is what I mean by theism. And by monism, I mean a position in which could be called acosmism, in the sense that only God exists. There is nothing apart from God. While in theism, God is reality, is true reality, and his creatures don't have independent ontological existence, but they are, in some sense, they are real. So I think a concept which can help us in understanding these two, and these two visions of reality, I think they are the only real positions, because I don't believe there is anything that is something called pantheism. It's a modern term. I think it's not coherent. Leszek Kolakowski, Polish historian of ideas, he said that pantheism basically means that there is no God, because if God equals the world, there is only the world. Some people introduced the term panentheism to save us from pantheism. But when people define panentheism, they are just speaking about classical theism, I think. So, for instance, panentheism means that things are in God. Well, Aquinas says that. Any Christian theologian says that before modernity. So I don't think pantheism or panentheism is helpful. There is monism, so there is only God. But it seems to us that the many exists, which is a mistake, epistemological error, or the many exist, the one exists, and the many are the manifestation of the one. So illusion would be, for me, a good way to clarify this. And what is illusion? So two parables or two examples. One is a sort of a stock metaphor or stock parable in Mahayana Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta, which is a parable about a rope mistaken for a snake. Someone enters a dark room and it seems to this person that there is a snake, so potentially very dangerous thing out there. But when he comes closer or there is more light, he realizes it's just a rope. Leibniz, in his Theodicy, he gave another example, much less poetical, namely of a square tower which seems to be round if you're standing far away from it. Leibniz says, here's an example of error, which we have already employed. I see a tower, which from a distance appears round, although it is square. The thought that the tower is what it appears to be flows naturally from that which I see. And when I dwell on this thought, it is an affirmation. It is a false judgment. But if I pursue the examination, if some reflection causes me to perceive that appearances deceive me, and behold, I abandon my error. So what does this mean? Illusion is that there is some reality, but the way the reality is perceived is mistaken. So if someone sees a rope and he believes that it's a snake, there is no snake. There is only the rope there. The snake exists as some kind of mental mistake or false judgment, as Leibniz put it, which means that ontologically there is no snake. There has never been any snake. The same with a round tower, mistaken for the square tower, the other way around. So Tainer believes that in monistic metaphysics and mysticism, and I quote Tainer, there can be no union or communion. There is unity, but there is no union. Because if the many don't exist, there can be no union between a created being and God. There is unity, but union implies a process. Something happens. But in monistic metaphysics, nothing happens because there is just one being, which we can call God if we want. And actually, one of the very interesting, I think, and clear teachers of Advaita Vedanta, an Englishman called Rupert Spira. You can see his clips on the YouTube. He writes books as well. And 2 years ago, he published a book, The Heart of Prayer. He's not a Christian, but he wrote a book about the true essence of Christianity, which is a bit suspect to me, but here we are. And he says, the individual and God cannot unite, for they were never separate to begin with. As a concession to the apparent individual, what is traditionally referred to as union with God is the revelation of our prior unity. But not even that, for there was never a time when there was a being apart from God's being, either to be separate or unified. I think this is very clear, and this is a helpful kind of clarity, that there can be no union with God in what I call monism in this paper. And the Tainer said decades ago, there can be no union or communion. There is just unity which has to be realized. Actually, this is what Friedrich Schelling said much earlier in his freedom essay, 1809, when he was discussing Spinoza and what was called pantheism at the time. So Schelling writes, if things are nothing, they don't exist, how is it possible to blend God with them? Then there is nothing anywhere but pure, unblemished divinity. This is what I call monism. Or if there is nothing besides God, not simply extra, but rather also praeter deum, how can he be all things other than merely in words? So if we are monists, we cannot say that all things are God, because things don't exist. Things are an illusion. We can only say that there is just God. That's it. And Schelling believes that Spinoza wasn't a monist. So for Schelling, because Spinoza allows some kind of ontological status to the many, we cannot say that he was a monist or pantheist, as they called it. And Schelling believes that the problem with Spinoza is his determinism, mechanistic view, but not the identification of the many with the one. So, of course, Christianity is not monism, and if Christianity accepted monism, it wouldn't make any sense. But Christianity is Christianity at the core of Christianity is theistic mysticism, which means not that we are God, whatever we do, whether we know this or not, but we can become God. Of course, this language since early 13th century was treated as suspicious. But it was treated as suspicious, and because two thinkers, David of Dinan, two French scholars, Aristotelians, by the way, from the University of Paris, David of Dinan and Amalric of Bene, they claimed that God is all things, and we don't have their works. But it seems that they believe that either God is substratum of all things, or that there are no things apart from God, and it caused some condemnations. Eriugena got hit by this because they conflated Eriugena with this view, and the whole pantheistic controversy started to develop from early 13th century. And I will say in a few minutes about why the 13th and 14th century became such a difficult and interesting time for mysticism. But well, another thing before I go further, what does it mean to become God, or what does it mean to become something? Aquinas says that no being can desire its annihilation or destruction, which makes sense, I think, because if we transform into something completely different, then we cannot really desire that, because we desire some good, and we have to possess this good. And non-existence is not a good that we can desire and possess and rest in and be happy. So if we really desire to stop existing as creatures and then in some way to start being God, if this is possible, this is not something we could desire. It would be just the destruction of creatures. So becoming God cannot mean complete ontological dissolution. And this would be, again, irreconcilable with Christianity, that God would create things and say, this is all very good, let's destroy it, let's, because why would God destroy creation? It wouldn't be a union of creation with God, it would be just destruction of things. So when we hear terms, or when we see images like dissolution, mingling with God, annihilation, all of that in Christian tradition, it cannot mean, I think, that creatures stop existing ontologically. But still, for the church, it was a bit suspicious for obvious reasons, because it's not very easy to understand how we can become what we are not and still be what we are. But this is exactly, I think, the point and the paradox behind this tradition, that we can become what we are not, but not just vanish. We can still be ourselves, but also not be ourselves, be something more. And this, it's a paradox. I think reality is paradoxical in that way. So we can become God, but it doesn't mean that we cease to exist, or it doesn't mean that we are just identical to God as he is in himself. So now we move to the 13th century, which Bernard McGinn, a great scholar of Western mysticism, he described this period as a sort of a key moment of transformation into what he referred to as democratic mysticism, or democratization of mysticism. Up until the 12th century, spiritual life, now I will be speaking about the West, the Latin Europe, spiritual life and mystical life was centered in the monasteries. So the monks were living in the monasteries. Many of them were well educated. They were studying the scripture and praying with the scripture. They were reading whatever sources from antiquity they possessed. But there was no mysticism for wider public. But in the 13th century, we can see that mysticism spills out of the monasteries. And uneducated people become interested in spiritual life and mystical life. And including many women. This is the period where women become mystics, much more important and interesting than men, actually. And the church, at the same time, the church tries to do two things. The church approves of the Franciscans and Dominicans, and the Council of Lateran says, okay, let's share the mystical life with everyone. So they didn't. So the Pope didn't want to reject Saint Francis. He thought, okay, Saint Francis will channel spiritual life for everyone. But at the same time, there were problems because uneducated mystics were saying a lot of weird things. So yeah, so we have all these condemnations of heresy and the black legend of the Inquisition and all that. But in fact, this was a serious problem. How we can preserve what Christianity has ever been, share this mystical core with everyone, at the same time not to create like 20 or 30 different Christianities, as it is called in a recent scholarship for some reason. So this is the 13th century problem of how can you have a democratic mysticism without some kind of structure and some kind of control over the interpretation of these experiences. And the most prominent movement of this democratic period of mysticism was so-called free spirit heresy. Although when I used that term, which was a traditional term, in a grant application, the grant was refused because I learned from anonymous reviewers that there is no such thing as heresy. I shouldn't use that word. Because heretics may feel bad, I guess, or something like that. They may even be traumatized by this. So I changed it into free spirit movement, and I got the grant. So that's reassuring. Yeah, so free spirit movement or free spirit heresy, whatever we call it, it was focused on what I think we can broadly conceive as theosis. So the name came from the idea that a person united with God, a person who becomes God, is absolutely free. St. Paul says, where there's spirit, there's freedom. Into freedom, Christ has liberated us. So they were claiming that once we are fully united with God, we can do whatever we want, like Augustine's saying, love and do whatever you wish. Because when we are one with God, we cannot really sin. This was problematic because the sinlessness of a mystic, it was seen as not very coherent with the Christian tradition. Of course, with Saint Augustine, who on his deathbed he was reciting these penitential psalms, and Augustine believed really we are always sinners, no matter how deeply we are united with God. So there was a reaction towards this claim that we can achieve perfection in this life through mystical transformation of becoming God. On the other hand, in what sense we can become God, as Saint Athanasius said and others, God became man, so man could become God. If we become God, how can we sin? Right? If someone has become God through union, God cannot sin. So this is a problem, clearly. So one of the most interesting figures of the free spirit movement was a French lay mystic, a Béguine, as they were called, Marguerite Porete. She died in 1310. Actually, she was burned at the stake outside of Paris on 1st June of 1310, just a couple of days before her many Templars were burned. Scholars believe her burning at the stake was a political thing because Philip the Fair, he was dealing with the Templars in his own way, and it was a statement. They wanted to release her, but she wouldn't speak to anyone. So she remained completely silent during the investigations for reasons which are interesting, but we cannot really, of course, explain why she refused to talk to anyone. And she wrote a book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, or Mirror of Simple and Annihilated Souls, which became very influential despite the condemnation, the book was condemned during her life. She was asked not to spread the book and the message. She didn't obey, and that's why she was arrested. Later, the book was translated immediately into Latin, into Middle English, into Italian, many vernacular languages. It's a very interesting book. The main point of the book is that at the advanced stages of mystical journey, the soul loses the will. It doesn't have will anymore. Only the will of God is operating in a soul. And Marguerite, she wrote in a very paradoxical way. So you can see, for instance, an example. Such a soul, says Love, has retained no will, but instead has arrived at and fallen into willing nothing and the certain knowledge of knowing nothing. And this knowing nothing and willing nothing have released and freed her. I would tend to see these kinds of statements as experiential statements, phenomenological statements, or first-person perspective statements. The distinction that I use in my book on Platonism, first-person perspective and third-person perspective. So, in other words, it's a real experience. I have no will, I have no desire. I do only things that God does in me. It's a real experience, but the problem is whether this is what actually happens, that we can lose a faculty of willing or desiring. But this is what the free spirits claimed. In Latin and in Italy was called perdere desiderium, that it's possible to lose the capacity to desire anything. It was a contentious claim, probably influenced in some way by the ideal of apatria, of the Desert Fathers. But Marguerite, I don't think she really meant that our will is completely ontologically destroyed. Why would God create our will just to take it away completely ontologically? So in another chapter, Marguerite says, for the, reason, it's a dialogue between love, reason, soul, the church, different characters. So reason says, for the sake of God's love, what are you saying? You say that the soul has no will? Love, without fail, it is so. Because all that this soul wills in consent is what God wills that she will. So Love, when pressed here in the dialogue, she says, she has will, but her will is so completely united with God's will that we should say she has no will. So I think ontologically, Marguerite believed will has to exist, but the point is that if we experience our will as independent from God's will, it means we are not advanced enough in our mystical journey. Another key concept that is used by Marguerite is the concept of nothing or nothingness. She uses that a lot, for instance. Such a soul is so transparent in understanding that she sees herself to be nothing in God and God nothing in her. But she understands nothing in many different ways, which is sometimes confusing. One of the ways she conceived of nothing is that nothing is our nothingness before we were created. So before we were created, we were nothing. We hadn't existed. And at the same time, she claims that we are to, in some way, become this non-existence or this nothingness before we had been created or were created. So she says the first thing which she asks is that she see herself always, if she is to see anything, where she was when God made all things from nothing, so that she might be certain that she is not other than this nothingness. So this is the annihilation, mystical annihilation. Again, is the point to that God destroys what he created? I don't think that she really believed that, and it's not a viable interpretation. And this seems, of course, very bold, and it seemed very bold for people who condemned her, that it's going beyond the limits of Christian mysticism, Christian metaphysics, and Christian faith. But we find that language already in Plotinus in a certain way. Plotinus says, in 6.9, the soul becomes what she was before. And we can assume that what she was before the many proceeded from the one. So we find also in the 20th century this kind of language of nothingness. And Simone Weil, for instance, great mystic, maybe a bit controversial, but quite popular, at least in the Catholic circles. She writes, I must love being nothing. How horrible it would be if I were something. I must love my nothingness, love being a nothingness. I must love with that part of the soul which is on the other side of the curtain. For the part of the soul which is perceptible to consciousness cannot love nothingness. It has a horror of it. Though it may think it loves nothingness, what it really loves is something other than nothingness. If we find fullness of joy in the thought that God is, we must find the same fullness in the knowledge that we ourselves are not, for it is the same thought. My I is hidden for me and for others. It is on the side of God. It is in God. It is God. To be proud is to forget that one is God. Again, I think this is not heretical, what she says, if we understand it as an experience, and also if we understand her claim that it is God on the other side of the curtain, that there is something in us which is uncreated. And I will move towards Eckhart in a moment. What Weil seems to point to is that there is an archetype of every created being in God. There is an idea or a logos or an archetype in God. And in God, everything is God. So in that sense, we exist in God as God, but we also exist as creatures. And this is the tension and the paradox that has to be there. Let's take a somewhat more orthodox example, namely a poem by Karol Wojtyła, later Holy Father John Paul II. He wrote this poem, The Song of the Hidden God, during the war, where Poland was occupied by Germans, and it's a very beautiful, mystical poem, inspired not only by his experience, but by his study of St. John of the Cross. And Wojtyła writes, to feel that moment of nothingness, that moment before creation, and never to depart from it. We never depart from our shadows. So our nothingness is like a shadow. It's always there. We're just not aware of it. To return always to that time when I was cuddled only with your thought and had innocence greater than a child and a deeper transparency. Today, stunned with existence, I keep forgetting my nothingness. I wander among distant rays, divorced from the simplest rays. But one glance into the depth is enough. The glance which the eternal reveals among the flow, the one simplest glance by which I dwell again in your thought. So for Wojtyła, obviously, we exist in the thought of God as God, and this is our nothingness before creation, and we exist as creatures. So in Marguerite, we find all of this in a very strongly paradoxical, expressed in paradoxical terms. So, for instance, she writes, he is, God is, and nothing is lacking from him. I am not, and so nothing is lacking from me. So again, I am not, he is, he exists. God is true reality. Marguerite writes, there is no one except him. Okay, is it monism? No one loves except him, for no one is except him, and thus he alone loves completely and sees himself completely alone and praises completely alone by his being itself. Taken out of context, this is monism, but of course, she doesn't really believe that creation didn't happen or it was somehow reversed. She believes in theosis, that is not that we are God, and that's it, and we are just mistaken that we are individuals or creatures. She believes in transformation, and she writes about this a lot. So can you, for instance, she writes, soul says, very sweet, pure, divine love, says the soul. How it is a sweet transformation, but which I am transformed into the thing which I love better than myself, and I am so transformed that I have lost my name in it for the sake of love. I who am able to love so little. So she feels transformed into God by love, but it doesn't mean that she never existed or that her existence was abolished. The scholars have demonstrated that Meister Eckhart read Marguerite Porete, and he was deeply influenced by her. For instance, his most famous sermon, I think, Sermon 87, about the spiritual poverty. You know, the spiritual man doesn't have anything, doesn't know anything, and doesn't want anything. This is taken from Marguerite Porete. She literally says this a couple of times. So Eckhart was deeply influenced by her, and you're probably familiar with this concept of the spark. Sometimes Eckhart sounds almost monistic when he says, for instance, that there is something in ourselves which is uncreated and uncreatable. There is the spark which is absolutely one. It has nothing to do with anything. Why call it a spark if this is just God in us? So that's probably, I would interpret this as our archetype in God. And then it makes complete sense. So there is a scholastic saying, creatura in Deo est creatrix essentia, which means creature in God is a creating essence, which basically means that every creature in God is God. So Eckhart's saying that I created myself. Well, Thomas Aquinas would never say that because it doesn't sound very good in public, at least. But it's no different from creatura in Deo est creatrix essentia. Everything exists in God, and in God everything is God. So everything is at the same time the creator and creature. And again, we have this paradox. So Eckhart, he speaks in some places, and some of these saints, not all of them, were condemned in 1329. That, for instance, he says, I am my own cause according to my essence, which is eternal. And during the inquisitorial proceedings, Eckhart was, Eckhart said at the beginning, I cannot be a heretic because heresy is in the will. Heresy is a willful rejection of the authority of the church. So I'm no heretic because I want to submit. And he also argued that his teaching is basic Platonism, the doctrine of participation. And he said, well, what I say is no different from what St. Augustine says on the Trinity. Augustine says, we become what we love. If we love the sensible and the material, we become this. And if we love God, we become God. So Eckhart claimed this is the Christian orthodoxy. Really, well, his inquisitors were of somewhat a different opinion, but and he was, of course, a great professor of the University of Paris, which was a controversial place, of course, as we know. Aquinas, some of his statements were condemned towards the end of the 13th century. And in Eckhart, we find the same metaphysics of nothingness as we find in Marguerite Porete. So Eckhart speaks a lot about finding God as nothing, seeing God as nothing, like the way he interprets St. Paul's blindness. You know, Paul fell from the horse and he nihil videbat, he saw nothing. And Eckhart says it has four meanings. You know, he saw that God was nothing, he saw that creatures were nothing, he saw that there was nothing, that God created things out of nothing, and also different meanings of nothingness. We find this a lot in his vernacular sermons. We have to become what we were before we were created. Eckhart says, man should be as free from his own knowledge as he was when he was not. So again, the same idea. But at the same time, Eckhart is speaking about theosis, about becoming God, and he is using his most famous image of divine birth. If there is divine birth in the soul, it means that something happens. It's not about realizing that I was always God. It's about becoming the Son of God. And Eckhart says, we become the one Son of God, the same Son of God. The inquisitors, of course, they had a problem with this kind of language. But again, this is the basic view of theosis. I think that we become God, but at the same time, we are creatures, and we will always be creatures in this process of becoming God. There is an infinite process, it seems, according to some at least. But also Eckhart is referring to the Chalcedonian idea of hypostatic union when he says, you should know what a man is like who has come to this. We can well say he is God and man. Observe, he has gained by grace, very orthodox language here, he has gained by grace all that Christ had by nature. So for Christ, it was a matter of realizing what he always was, but for us, it's not a matter of seeing that there is no snake, there is just the rope. We are God. We just thought we were individuals. No, we have to be born as the sons of God. We have to be transformed. And his body, says Eckhart, is so fully suffused with the noble essence of the soul, which she has received from God and the divine light, that we may well declare that is a man divine. So we are to become God-man, or man and God, just like Christ was. And I will end with Saint Angela of Foligno, who lived almost exactly at the same time as Marguerite Porel, but she lived in Italy. And it's interesting that we don't find in her such a strong language of being nothing or being in God before creation, but she speaks about nothingness a lot. On her deathbed, she was crying, according to her disciples, O nihil incognitum, O unknown nothingness, O unknown nothingness. And she, when she arrived at the transformation that she describes in her spiritual autobiography, she says, she uses a very interesting paradoxical language. She says, for in the cross of Christ, in which, for in the cross of Christ, in which I used to take such delight, so as to make it my place of rest and my bed, I find nothing, nihil invenio. And you can understand it in Latin in two ways. At the cross of Christ, I don't find anything anymore. No, it doesn't speak to me. That's one possible interpretation. Or in the cross of Christ, I find nothingness, nothingness of God, nothingness of the self. In the poverty of the Son of God, I find nothing, nihil invenio. And in everything that could be named, I find nothing. So a very strong language. Although, well, we learned that there were some denigrators and detractors, but Saint Angela was never condemned. Actually, she was made a saint. So, but probably because she never used the language of identity before creation. Her main idea is that there are two mystical experiences which can happen simultaneously. One is the experience of darkness, as she calls it, seeing God in darkness. And the other experience is the experience of the loving union with the God-man. And about darkness, she says, when I am in that darkness, I do not remember anything about anything human or the God-man. There is no Christ in darkness, or anything which has a form. Nevertheless, I see all and I see nothing. As what I have spoken of withdraws, darkness, and stays with me, I see the God-man. He draws my soul with great gentleness, and he sometimes says to me, you are I, and I am you. I see then those eyes and that face so gracious and attractive as he leans to embrace me. In short, what proceeds from those eyes and that face is what I said that I saw in that previous darkness, which comes from within, and which delights me so that I can say nothing about it. When I am in the God-man, my soul is alive. And I am in the God-man much more than in the other vision of seeing God with darkness. The soul is alive in that vision concerning the God-man. The vision with darkness, however, draws me so much more that there is no comparison. On the other hand, I am in the God-man almost continually. So it seems that for her, the loving union with the God-man, with Christ, and she has these visionary experiences of him and all of that, it's continuous. And later in life, she claims it's continuous, while the seeing of God in darkness, which she also calls seeing God in uncreated light, this is not uninterrupted for her, as far as we can tell. So she uses the language of transformations, but only in her later writings. Well, she was probably literate. She was just dictating in the vernacular to Franciscan friars who translated this into Latin, possibly adding this metaphysical terminology, but I don't think that, I think this is really what she was talking about. So I will end with her point that there are three transformations. One transformation is transformation into God's will. The second one is transformation with God, cum Deo. And the third one is transformation into God, intra Deum or in Deum. So the first one, she says, is ascetical moral purification. The second transformation is a loving union of two wills, which used to be the standard way the monastic mystics were speaking about these things. But the third transformation is something that we find in Marguerite Porete, in Eckhart, and other mystics of that time. This is transformation into God. We become God. And so she says that this is the power of love that transforms the lover into the beloved and the beloved into the lover. So soul is transformed, and she uses classical images. Iron becomes fire, or air becomes light. This is traditional language, but she insists that this is a theotic transformation. She says, moreover, we must ponder with great care what she also said, Angela, namely that the elevations into the uncreated and the transformation into the crucified placed her in a continual state of being plunged into the fathomless depths of God and of being transformed into the crucified, a state which she believes will be hers forever. So again, the divine nature of Christ and his humanity become the way to understand how we can be Christians in union with the God-man, with Christ, but at the same time, we can experience this nothingness, this darkness, this sense that there is no separation, no difference between us and God, although Christ is the one who reminds us that we still exist as creatures because he became creature. So I think this is a very interesting and really Christian way of uniting this democratic, somewhat apophatic, and sometimes crazy mysticism of the 13th and 14th century with very traditional Christian doctrine. And I will end with one point that this is, well, of course, there is this anxiety about this monistic or pantheistic language, but Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, a great medieval mystic, he used three images, and this became sort of a stock metaphor. So he said, stilla aquae modica multo infusa vino, so a small drop of water infused into great amount of wine, then luce perfusus air permeated by light, and ferrum ignitum, so iron on fire. But the first image is often used by what we sometimes call pantheistic thinkers. So Christians seem to be very anxious of saying that the soul melts in God. But this is what happens at every Mass. I believe in Catholicism and Anglicanism and Orthodoxy, where when priest puts a little bit of water into wine, this is the image of what is taking place. What's the difference between a drop of water when it falls into the chalice of wine? But this is not a Hindu idea, right? This is a Christian idea of the union with God. But of course, the God-man reminds us that humanity doesn't dissolve in divinity. Humanity is there and divinity is there. They are united in the God-man. Thank you.